Today, I'm going to drink coffee. Now, I'm going to blast through 5 mix tips to get you to a better place faster. Maybe you're an artist or a producer and you just don't really have aspirations to become a mix engineer. Well, I'm going to line you up with some ideas to get your mixes to a better place much faster so that they're more presentable and so that you can make your intentions more clear. I'm also going to have a little heart-to-heart with you about the gear you're using, a little reality check about what all that stuff really means. So let's hit that red button and get recording. So what I'm going to do is break it down into a procedure that is sort of my macro for a lot of things that I work on, and it's not always the same because I switch it up so that I don't get bored, but it's a system that I always sort of fall back to, and it's better to have a plan than no plan, and at least if you attack it, it can identify, or you can identify what some of the problems you might be encountering are and some solutions. So no, it's not a comprehensive mix course, but you know, maybe you're an artist or an engineer, as I mentioned, and you're not really interested in learning how to mix records, but you want to get your stuff to a better place faster, and also if you can give your intentions to the next person. So maybe there's a mix engineer coming behind you. If you can sort of voice what your idea is in a more concise way, that helps everybody else. At least you can get something that's more presentable to play for people so that your ideas are coming through in a more powerful, forceful, clearer, more intentioned way. So let's start with number 1. I do a lot of pop, urban, R&B. Stuff usually has big drums in it, and you know, let's be honest, a lot of stuff we work on now is pretty drum centric. So what you find is the earlier you bring something into the mix, the more prominent or bigger a role it's going to play. So with a lot of what we do, obviously the drums are really the driving force in the arrangement, so I like to start with the drums, and it really lays that foundation. Now here's a tip, within that framework, bring the kick drum up, and that's your starting point until it's about minus 10 dB on the main fader, and that way your gain structure, I know you don't really want to know what that is, but it won't get too hot because you can always make a mix a little bit louder, but it's hard to make it quieter. If you mix too loud, your DAW won't sound very good, and you'll be really fighting a lot of problems, and it'll make the mix very unclear. So start with drums and get that feeling nice, get the balances. Maybe you don't know how to EQ stuff and everything, but hopefully you've chosen some pretty good sounds, and that will be your foundation. Let's go on to step number 2. So, in keeping with the idea that the sooner you bring it into the mix, the bigger and more prominent it is, I like to bring in the vocal. If it's an instrumental thing, you know, the main melody part, but usually it's the vocal, I like to bring that in next. If it has a lot of knobs on it, I know that you kind of don't want to deal with that. I would suggest what we call sometimes magic boxes. There's a Chris Lord-Alge one, he's a famous mix engineer, CLA. Waves makes that. They also make the Greg Wells one. So these are plugins that have compression, EQ, reverb, delay, all built in, and you can like add a little bit of brightness, add a little bit of body, add a little bit of reverb, whatever, to flavor, and it's a little bit easier for someone who doesn't really understand like an engineer's tool that has all kinds of knobs with frequencies labeled and compression and ratios and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, a lot of engineers don't like this stuff, but I think if you're not an engineer, and hey, I use them too, I think it can be a really, really great way to get to a really decent sound really quickly. Now, for making a record, maybe it doesn't quite get you there all of the time, but look, lots of engineers use this stuff. You just have to figure out how to best use it for you. I would really suggest you have a look at those. Now, in keeping with that, bring the vocal in, make sure that the way that you want the song to feel is right. So you've got the vocal going and you've got the drums going, it's feeling good, the vocal's got the right kind of auras. Remember that the genre you're in will affect how you choose the reverb and the delay. So listen to other stuff that is sort of in the same ballpark or genre as what you're doing, and don't make it sound all different. Now you might put on a bunch of reverb and think, wow, that sounds really great, but listen to the other stuff in your genre and make sure that what you're doing is sort of in keeping with that, because nothing screams amateur like effects that are just really sticking out and sounding out of place. Okay, so just to go over it, I know that I'm not plugged in, you can't hear it how it all would sound perfectly, but you know, I would start with the drums and get them feeling good, like I've done here. And then after that, I would get the vocals in.
Cause you broke it, what you got to say? I don't think you care for what I'm thinking. I don't think you care what I believe in. You can't change the...
So that's what I'm doing, is I'm getting all that stuff lined up, and the drums and the vocals feel good, and the sound is right. Now, you're going to have to adjust that a little bit. Yeah, my phone's ringing. And then, so you get the drums in, and then you get the vocal in. All you're worried about at this point is a good relative level. Nothing's written in stone. You can turn up anything up or down after this. You're just trying to get it to feel right and have the sound of the vocal engaging and stylistically in the right place. So after that, I add in the bass, and the reason why it's the first big element that's usually going to have long notes. So I put that in, and then right away you're going to know if it's stepping on any part of the vocal. So there's a couple things you need to figure out. One is it stepping on the vocal? So keep it at a level where it's not getting in the way of the vocal. You might have to do some EQ. We'll talk about something called masking in a second. And you need to make sure that the kick drum and the bass are cooperating. So what I mean by that is there's a war going on below, some people would say 80 hertz or so. The real trouble is sort of around, the focus of it is usually around 60, 50 hertz. You might have to intervene and decide who's going to win. If those elements are too loud, I know that so many people want big bass, and we want that. But if it's too loud, it makes the track start to actually feel like it's slowing down, and it starts to feel like it's bogging. So what you're going to have to do is take an EQ, and you're going to have to maybe go around 50, 40 to 60 hertz somewhere, and you might have to lower that, 2, 3, maybe even 6 or 7 dB in either the kick drum or the bass to get clarity. Now, I'll leave that up to you. I often find for me it works well to notch out the bass, because what I really want out of the bass most of the time is the feeling of the root motion of the changes and good support, and you can have a really good feeling of size in bass without having the sub, but it does depend on genre a little bit and what kick drum sound you have to start with. So maybe just experiment with pulling a little bit of that out of either one and seeing which one feels right. Vocal in. Now, I've worked in this obviously already, but you can hear how when I put the bass in, there's no takeaway from the vocal. It feels nice and full, it's grooving, it's feeling like I want it, and so I've already made those adjustments, but the point is, you're building your house of cards here, and if any one of these foundational pieces is off, now's your opportunity to fix it before it starts to get confusing. Let's go on to number 4. So 4 is bring in the chordal elements, the big ones, like the piano, the guitar, the keyboards, whatever that might be. And you might be working from something that you already have, and I would suggest instead of bringing the faders down, just hit the mute buttons and bring these things in one at a time. Now what this does for you is as you bring each element in, you have the vocal in already. As you bring it in, if the vocal starts to be hidden or going away, something that's called masking is happening, and that's when frequencies are beating up on each other. So keyboards, guitars, they all tend to live, a lot of it, in the same mid-range space as the vocal. So what you can do when you bring in an element and it starts to bury the vocal, if you feel like it's kind of like at the right level, there's a couple things you can do. You might try bringing it down a little bit, or if you like the balance and you think it's about right, take an EQ. Look, this is pretty macro, but take an EQ, take it to 1000 hertz or 1K, pull down that frequency by about 6 dB and move it around a little bit and see if the vocal clears up. And what you're doing is you're getting that stuff out of the way. Now, if you find a place where it's getting out of the way of the vocal, you can start to bring it back in a little bit, and if you've started with like sort of a wide band, you can narrow it so you're not losing as much of the instrument. You're not trying to make a super huge space for the vocal, you just need a pocket for it to sit in. just being careful that you don't lose the instrument itself. So that's how you attack it. And I know engineers will say that's just oversimplified, but at the level that we're at, and we're just trying to do triage here to get this thing sounding better, faster, we're going to choose the vocal over the supporting instrument sound in this situation. We want to make sure that that engagement and focus stays in place with that vocal. So in the chorus of this song, this is the kind of element I'm talking about. It's playing a pretty big range, but it's supportive. You need it to make the size of the chorus feel right, but you need it to be out of the way of the vocal. So that's the kind of element I'm talking about. After that, 5, supporting elements. So this guitar, it doesn't take up a ton of space. It's a supporting element, so there's a lot more room for that small thing to exist. We put that in last because it's not vitally important to the size, but it helps the rhythmic feel, and it helps the shape and the genre and the vibe of the song. So you've put that in last, and just make sure that that's not stepping on anything else. You can accomplish that with EQ. You can also accomplish that with panning, so moving it side to side. For me, and this is just me, and this actually goes back to old mixing boards, I actually like to be pretty aggressive with this stuff. I'm going to either have it here or I'm going to move it off to the side, either way, and I'm going to make that not so subtle most of the time. Now, see what feels right for you, but you need to get things out of the way of the important stuff, so don't get in the way of the vocal, don't get in the way of a key melody part, so bring in those supportive things at the end. Okay, so now, hopefully you've sorted things out a little bit. You might be hearing things in a different way. So you've done some EQs, you've maybe pulled some frequencies out to get some what we call separation so that the vocal's more clear. You can do this between different instruments too. So if you've got a piano and a guitar that are playing at the same time, you could try and figure out which frequencies are clashing with each other. Now the goal at this point is to just get things out of each other's way, and we kind of call it like a frequency puzzle. It's how all the pieces fit together. One little thing that might not seem so intuitive when you're dealing with masking is, let's go with the example of, say, the guitar piano kind of thing, or synth, whatever you have, and you're EQing the synth to get out of the way of the piano. Pianos are really hard to get out of the way of things because they take up so much space. So say you've got a synth, well, while you're pulling frequencies out of the synth, don't listen to the synth. Listen to the piano and see how that's clearing up. And that's the goal, is to make that clarity. Now, you're not trying to sacrifice the synth, but lots of times you'll find that the sound, you don't perceive it any differently, but it gets out of the way of the other thing. The step after that would be EQing to make things sort of move forward or sound better, but the starting point is to get things to at least cooperate. Now, once you get to that phase, something interesting might happen, and it often happens on projects I'm working on, and that is, now that you have clarity, you might find that you don't need everything in the arrangement. So tip number 1, when you're putting an arrangement together, if you have to do really aggressive things to make elements fit together that isn't like for weird effect or to just alter a sound so much because it sounds so cool, but you're trying to jam together elements that are really hard to fit, maybe you need to look for different elements. If you haven't chosen your sounds well, they might not fit together so well. I find with most really good arrangements, without doing any EQ, it sort of is already there. The other thing is, you might find that there's stuff in there that you are adding to the arrangement that, well, in the end, you don't really need it. I often find there's a couple percussion elements that I can take out. There's maybe some chordal stuff. So when you're doing the arrangement, you're going for size, you're going for excitement. And what you find is, a little bit further down the road, when things are playing a more prominent role, when they're sort of counting more for what they're doing, maybe you can thin it out a little bit, and by that I don't mean make it smaller. What actually tends to happen, the part gets more forceful, plays a more prominent role, and really counts for more. So it's always better if your mix can be bigger, simpler, more concise. You'll find that it has a much bigger impact if you're getting the stuff that's sort of like the deadwood out of the way. So don't be afraid to use that mute button if it makes sense, once you've gotten some clarity and you understand what's going on. And always, if you get a little bit lost, start muting things to find out where the trouble is. Mute, 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 mute. Oh, it feels good again. Start unmuting stuff, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I know, that's the problem, that's what's bogging down the track. So it's about troubleshooting and triage, how to get the problems out of the way. So in the order of things that you bring in, my suggestion is drums are big rhythmic element, but let's just go with drums and keep it simple. Drums first, bring in the vocal, make sure that that all feels nice. The vocal might feel a little bit on the loud side if it's proportionally in the right spot because there's nothing else getting in the way yet. So that's okay. Make sure that, you know, on your little magic box you've got sort of like the right reverb and delay feeling. You can bring that up a little bit later, up or down, depending on what feels right. The idea is to make sure that the drums are forceful and full and that the vocal is sitting in a good place and that everything feels good. Next, bring in bass. So this is where the size is going to come in. You want to make sure that it's not stepping on the vocal, and you want to make sure that it's not getting in the way of the kick drum. 4. The big chordal elements, pianos, guitars, synths, any big holding things that are taking up a big range, a lot of space. Unmute them, bring them in one at a time. That way you can figure out what things are getting in the way of the vocal. Vocal or frequency masking, dip those things out, move them around a little bit, and make sure that the vocal isn't getting drowned out. Lastly, bring in the elements that are the supportive elements, little parts, swooshes, white noise things, effects, and just make sure that that stuff is playing that supportive role and activating the track, and you'll know if it's getting in the way of all the other stuff. So what do you do now? Yes, it's a bare bones formula, but if you start to understand how these things work, then you can advance your techniques. Maybe you start using compression, maybe you start using EQ, fancier engineering kind of stuff. If you want to go down that road, I encourage you to go down that road. The point of this lesson is just to set you on a good path and have a system. So if you adhere to this, you'll actually start to understand how the frequencies are interacting with each other, and when you hear problems, well, you'll have some clue as to how to go about tackling them. The cool thing is, it'll get you closer to your intention. So even if a mix engineer and mastering engineer or somebody else is coming behind you to make it sound better, at least you can voice the idea and the intention for your musical idea more concisely. And hey, if it sounds better, that's a bonus. You can play it for people and maybe be a little bit more confident about what it sounds like and that your idea is coming through. I want to close with some thoughts about gear. Now, I'm seeing a lot of stuff on the internet about how you can record for really, really cheap, and I really do support that. I think that you should never let finances get in the way of your creativity, and the truth is, if you're after it, if you want to be a producer or a recording artist or a singer, you're not going to let that stop you. So I really encourage you that if what you can afford is a $100 microphone and $150 or $200 audio interface, then awesome. Go get started. I really think that that's so great. There are some messages out there that you can make a song, you're a beginner, you can write a song, you can go out and buy $500 worth of gear and a laptop and learn how to do this mixing stuff and mastering stuff, and your song is going to sound like a record. And the truth is, if I could make records with $500 worth of gear, I would be pretty happy to do that and put more money in my pocket. Record labels spend a lot of money, production companies spend a lot of money, not because they really, really want to. In fact, it's been tough times for record companies for the last 10 or 15 years. It's getting better now. They spend that money because it makes a difference. There's big recording studios, and I have this gear because it sounds better. And this gear doesn't do it all for you. There's no substitute for creativity. Great ideas, great songs, great performances beat gear every single time. But if you really, really want to go to that next level, realize that you might have to invest a little bit more in yourself or get people on your team who are really, really good at this stuff. So self-awareness is key. Gary Vaynerchuk, he's a motivational speaker. He talks about self-awareness a lot. That is, pursue what you're passionate about and what you're good at. They tend to be the same thing. So if it's writing songs, do that. If it's singing, do that. If it's engineering, do that. But just know that People spend their life getting good at any of these one things, and that's hard enough. There's Prince, and then there's all the rest of us. So focus on what you're good at and realize that it might take some investment, either in time or money, hiring the right person, getting the right thing to take your stuff really to the level that you really, really want to hear it at. And don't kid yourself. Stuff that sounds really, really amazing usually takes some great expertise and skill to accomplish. It would be so awesome of you if you would hit me with a comment. If you've got a question, I'd love to try and answer it. If you could share something that's working with you, in the spirit of us all helping each other out. If you've got something that's working for you, share it so that we can all learn. It'd be so great if you would tap that red subscribe button just like you hit the record button. I'll be here sharing everything I know about mixing, recording, getting your stuff out there, and a little bit of business too. I'm on a lifelong learning journey. I'd love to take it with you. See you next time.